Welcome to Storycomic Presents, where we interview amazing storytellers and artists. This is episode 269. I'm your host, Barney Smith of storycomic.com, and we're honored to have with us the inspiring storyteller and acclaimed author of Called a Memoir, Marek Redmond.
Hello, Barney. Thank you for having me on.
You are a professional storyteller.
There you go. It's true.
It's true. Yeah.
It is true. I am a professional storyteller. I've actually been paid money. I've been paid money to tell stories. I was paid last week to tell a story.
There you go. And it's all kind of like fomented from your Moth. When you're on the Moth, and that was 10 years ago. That was back in 2013 that you were on the Moth.
That's so. And if you listen to the Moth, which a lot of people do, at the end they always say, if you have a good story to tell, call 1-800-THE-MOTH and leave a 2-minute message. So I did that in 2013. Didn't think anything of it, and then about 6 months later, I get an email. Hey, I'm a producer in New York City for the Moth, and we got your 2-minute thing. We're coming to Burlington later this year. Call us. Maybe we'll put you on stage. So I literally called the producer. She said, all right, she said, tell me the story. So I told the story over the phone. She goes, okay, you're in. I said, what do you mean I'm in? She goes, we're going to have 5 storytellers at the Flynn Theater. And the people flying are our best storytellers from LA, New York, Chicago, and you're the Vermont storyteller. You represent Vermont. So now, so you're from the Northeast Kingdom. There's a famous person who lives in the Northeast Kingdom. Do you know who it is?
Was that the one that you also mentioned in one of your interviews, that was the second person that was
Charles Lindbergh's daughter? Reeve Lindbergh lives in the Northeast Kingdom. So they had me. She and I were the 2 Vermont storytellers. Isn't that funny? She told a story about her father, the famous aviator. So that's how it started. A 2-minute phone call that I left, 2-minute message. Right. And then, now I've been on stage in Montreal, Brooklyn, Boston. It's just taken off,
So I'm curious. So Mark, what is it? A lot of people, as they say, it seems human nature to tell stories because stories kind of combine us together, kind of creates a shared narrative and gives people the opportunity to understand that they're part of something larger than themselves. What is the essence of a story, and how can somebody make an anecdote into a good story?
It's funny. The Moth will say everybody has at least one good story in them, which I think everybody's got 100 good stories in them. Right. What's the essence of a good story? The guru in Vermont is the producer of the Moth in Burlington, Sue Schmidt, and she always says the story has got to tell transformation. What was the transformation? That's what you have to get to, How did the event or the conversation or what you were involved in, how did that transform you? That's what you've got to get across to the audience to tell a really good story,
Right. The story that you told that was actually on the Moth was about some of your experience with a church that you already kind of made a preconceived notion of what the church was all about.
That's right. I go in, it's this church. I'm not going to say which one it is, but, it's kind of like one of these mega churches that's kind of, somebody had called it the Hollywood church, So I went there to pick up some donations for Spectrum. And I went in there like, oh, man, I'm going to get in there and get out of there as quick as I can. These people are a bunch of phonies, Yeah. And just as I'm about to go, one of the adults says, oh, Mr. Redmond, before you go, there's a little girl here. She has something special for you. And this little 9-year-old kid drags this duffel bag up in front of me and puts it up in front of me. And I opened it up and it had soap and toothpaste and all that. And she looks at me, a little kid, and says, my family wants to give this to you to give to a boy at Spectrum in honor of my brother who just died. And so I opened up this duffel bag and there was a Bible in there. And I opened up the Bible and it had a card and it said, always remember. And it said, God is watching over you. And it has a picture of her brother. And it's a little 9-year-old girl. I'm expecting to see a little boy, but it's like a teenager, like a young man, like we work with at Spectrum. And I leaned over to the adult and I whispered to him, I said, how did her brother die? And he whispers back, heroin overdose. You know, so that was the transformation for me. Like, oh my gosh, here I am in there. Can't wait to get out of there. Kind of making fun of these people in my mind. You know, they're a bunch of phony Christians. And you know what? Some of these people are just in awful pain, terrible pain, you know? And if this church is where they want to go for healing and for hope and for peace, you know, what right do I have to judge that? And then I have none. So that was, there's more of the story, but that was the transformation, you know, about how easy it is to judge people and institutions in different places. But, and a lot of my stories are about that, about how we suppose one thing. We see somebody who's homeless or a prisoner, you know, we immediately brand them in our minds. But once we learn more about the person or the circumstances, it can really change the way we look at people and situations.
How important is storytelling for, like, from the advocacy lens?
It's really important. You know, I mean, a lot of my, you know, we're primarily a service organization. Last year, we took care of 1,280 kids who were either homeless or addicted or, you know, living in the woods or whatever. But a lot of my work is in the legislature, too. I'm in there a lot, you know, and right now we're about to release thousands of homeless families and teenagers from hotels, which is very sad. But when I'm in the legislature, the stories, that's what, you know, because those legislators, and my wife used to be one, they're listening to people all day, statistics and numbers, you know, they must glaze over. But if you can get in there and tell them, you got to tell them statistics and stuff. But if you can tell them, hey, and let me tell you about what happened to this young person who I know, you know, I think that has a tremendous, that cuts through all the other voices that they're hearing all day.
And so, to take me a little bit to talking about your book, called.
Yes.
How different is writing a book from telling a story?
Yeah, that's a good point, because it is different. So the book came out of, you know, I started telling these stories, and then I was on stage in Montreal. Then I got picked to do a one-man show on Broadway, which was cool, in 2019. Then I did a one-man storytelling show at the Flynn Theater a week after that. And I remember I went over to American Flatbread with some friends after my show, and this woman said to me, when do we see these in book form? You know, when do we see these? And I was like, that's like the fifth person, none of whom are related to it, to say that to me. So to me, that's a sign, you know, like, you know, I had tapes and videos of a lot of my stories, but you're right. It's different. You just don't take it word for word and plop it in on a page, right? You've got to build it up differently. So they tell a lot of the story, not all, there's many stories that are in the book I've told on stage, but it's different. It's a different medium, right? So you have to do it. So I had a lot of people look through the book and advise me and do this and revise. So the meat of the stories are in there, but it's definitely a different medium. So you really have to work at it.
So talk to us a little bit about that. How is it different? Like, what are some of the things that you had to expand on, more scenes, or did you have to cut down and put in different perspectives? How did that work, having to
because I think the other thing with telling a story, you have to, it's about transformation, but also I've learned, start with the action. So I told a story at a conference last Friday about going to rescue a suicidal girl. If I was going to write that, I would write like, so I was director of this program. It was located here. And then we had to, but instead I started off, it's 8 o'clock in the morning and I'm having my coffee and the phone rings. And the supervisor says, Mark, you need to get over here now. That new girl who's suicidal, she just ran out the woods towards the train tracks. You know what I mean? So that wouldn't work to write it like that, you know? You'd have to set it up. So that's kind of the difference. I like in my stories to hook. If you can start with the action, you hook people right in. Wow, they're going to listen to you for the next 5 or 6 minutes or whatever it is. Versus in writing, I find you have to set it up more, you know, and then ease a bit and then get into the action.
You're reading it as a script as compared to in a novelization form. You have to create the setting
Right.
and get, when you're talking from a storytelling perspective, you're actually interacting with the reader in that
Right.
sense.
That's
Where
right.
what you have to do, yeah.
But it was good.
And
It was a great process. Also, you know what it coincided? Then COVID hit, and none of it. I said nobody go to work at Spectrum. Everybody work from home, unless we have a shelter with homeless kids. Those people had to go to work.
Right.
The what's the necessary workers? Like we were like that. But said everybody else is admin like me, stay home. So all of a sudden, I had 1 hour free that instead of driving in an hour. I was like, well, I'm going to use this to write my book. I just found 2 spare hours a day. So I call it my COVID book. I really wrote a book during COVID, so it made it easier.
So yeah, so talk to us a little bit about that. How was working and trying to create and write inspirational and writing some of these thought-provoking stories? How did either COVID inspire or kind of drain you from that?
COVID was so, it came upon all of America so quickly, right? It was like something we would read about in Italy. Then the next week we're reading it about here. And then it was then like March, whatever it was, it was like bang,
Right.
And all of a sudden we're at Spectrum. I'm like, oh my God, we have 26 homeless kids living with us with shared bathrooms, shared kitchens. Remember, it was all nursing homes in the beginning. I'm like, I'm running a nursing home for teenagers. Like,
right.
And we didn't know how, nobody had masks and we didn't know how it was transmitted, so it was scary as heck, it really was. So I was involved with all of that. And then at the same time, then I do a lot of fundraising. I got to do that. And, there's all kinds of stuff trying to keep our board of directors together and then write the book. So I get up early anyway. So I really was able to write a lot of the book early in the morning, or then late at night when things calm down. So in a way, it gave me the time, otherwise I would be staying at work and working late, but we couldn't. None of us were allowed to go in, unless you were taking care of the kids. So in a way, it was COVID was sad. It was terrible. Look at all the lives that were lost. But it did provide opportunities for certain things,
Right. Your book called, as you mentioned, it's a memoir. Is this a collection of all of your stories, or is this new stories that maybe some of your fans or people that follow you might notice that this is actually something brand new?
Yeah, a lot of it is new. I took a lot. I took the stories, and worked in them, but then I added a lot of other stuff too. I thought maybe I should just make it all stories, but I was, no, let me make it a memoir. I dedicated it to my parents, and talked about because everybody asks, they're like, how did you get into this work? And I'm like, I'm still trying to figure that out. My parents still think this is a phase I'm going through. After 42 years,
Right.
I studied business. I had a job on Madison Avenue, the apartment, the car, the suit, like this was not in the cards that I'd spend 40 years working with homeless teenagers, gang members, substance abuse, mental health. That was not it. So that there was kind of a cool story, like how you take someone who was working on Madison Avenue and now he's working full-time helping homeless teenagers and stayed at it. And, there's wonderful things that happen. One of the stories is about, I still hear from these I was his counselor in 1981. He was a homeless 19-year-old kid. I still hear from him all the time. The first 15 years, he was mostly in prison. I would go visit him in prison, write him letters, and now he has his own business. I go every 5 years to his Narcotics Anonymous meeting. I'm the godfather to his little daughter. And there's terrible stories too. I had a worker get killed. I had a worker get stabbed to death by a kid high on crack cocaine. I wrote about that. So one of my workers was shot and killed by a cop, and I had to go identify the body,
Right.
So it's like, it would have been easy to write a book where like everything turned out great every time and every kid was helped. And everybody, but that's not the reality of what this work is,
Right.
And there can be some real disappointments and sometimes tragedy even. And I felt, to be honest, I had to include all that.
How important is it to tell those tragic stories? as a sense of transformation.
Because I think even when there's tragedy and it's sadness and we want to avoid it, there's still something to be learned from that. There's, you know what I mean? Like, I believe that so strongly. Like, I think, like even that young man who killed one of my workers, he stabbed to death a 65-year-old nun, I mean, this was front page news in New York. He's still in prison, and I still send him a Christmas card and a birthday card every year, and like, he did a terrible thing. He belongs in prison, but I also feel like he's still a human being,
Right.
And I remember I visited him in prison. Well, I happened to drive by the prison that he was in upstate New York. I thought, oh my God, he's in there. I think that's where he is. And I went in to see him, and I said, so how often do you get visitors? And he goes, you're the first person to come and see me in 10 years,
Wow.
I know, right? I was like, oh my God, So like, he did a terrible thing, but I think, there's that saying, none of us should be defined by the worst thing that we've done, We're all bigger than that and different than that. So for me, even when there's, it didn't work out with the youth that's back. There's this story about a young man that I wrote about. Love this kid. He wanted to be a Marine, homeless kid living in a car, lived at Spectrum, wanted to join the Marines. Oh, I want to be a Marine. I was okay. He joined the Marines. He finished boot camp. We sent someone down there because he didn't have any family to be there when they graduate, And then he left the Marines, like, I don't know, 2 months later, homeless in Burlington. We kept looking for him. And then I'm reading the Burlington Free Press online one night, and he shot himself in the head, killed himself. And I talked about going to the funeral, and meeting his family, and how I got a letter from a neighbor, and the neighbor wrote this letter and said, they wrote in the obituary, from the loving family of, I'll make the Smiths. And she said, that boy didn't have a loving family. I lived next door. He didn't grow up in a loving family. The only loving family he had was you and your coworkers at Spectrum. So like, it was a terribly sad thing for that young man to take his life. But the transformation was, he was loved and felt loved while he was with us. You know what I mean? And he knew that. So that's what I try and dig. Like, even when there's tragedy in this work, there's still something there, And I wrote, there's a picture of him. You walk into Spectrum, and there's this pictures of kids from years ago. And there's the pictures of kids having dinner together, laughing. And he's in that picture. Everybody else walks in that building. Oh, it's a bunch of kids. They don't know him. It was so long ago. But like, I look at it occasionally, I think, yeah, he was happy then. He was happy when he was with us. He took his life, months later, but he was for a short time. He was happy. So that makes me feel good, and it means something to me.
Right. Now, what advice would you give somebody that's looking at wanting to go into storytelling?
I would say find other people. There's like storytelling groups now. You can go to class. There's different from the comedy club. Comedy is different, right? This is, story. And I will run by. So if I'm going to, like when I did my one-person show on Broadway, like I ran through all the stories. I trust my wife. She's a good storyteller. She just told a story on stage in Massachusetts. My son, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to run this through. And there's a group of us. We've all gotten to know each other through the moth. None of us knew each other, And I'll get them to go, hey, come on, I'm going to get pizza. And I'm going to tell you I'm going to run through. And they'll be like, that one wasn't so good. Or add this. So you don't need that. No, that's running too long, So the best is the guy, he ran the Flynn for years. I love him, John Kalaki. Then he was in the legislature. He walks around with a cane. So he went to my he gave me all this advice. He goes, if you don't follow this advice, man, and I'm in the audience, you're going to see a cane flying through the air, headed for your head. So that's my thing would be get advice, run by people you trust, and
right.
They may say, yeah, it's fine as it is. Or they may say, add this, change this, and, tweak this here, and that can make a good story. The people at the Moth, when they first picked me to do it, I had to have a weekly coaching session. And I was
Wow.
like, every week I got this is one out for, oh my God. Then the day before, then a rehearsal. But I'll tell you, every change they reckon, looking back at it, they took a good story and really turned it into a great. They've played that story 3 times on their podcast. That's highly unusual, But the coach they gave me was so good. She was so good,
So what do you prefer doing now? Do you like telling a story to an audience, or do you prefer writing it down and having it to be more intimate than that with a reader?
So I love both. I still write columns. I write columns for different magazines. I do editorials for Vermont Digger, I love that. I love to write. I love to see my name in print, and I love to think I'm making it. If it's a political thing, I'm making an impact. We just had an increase in funding for homeless kids because of an op-ed that I wrote, which makes me feel good. So I like that. But I love the story. Like when I was on stage at Killington a few weeks ago, man, I just love that. I love interacting with the audience, making them laugh, making them gasp, I love that. The feedback, you get that feedback, you can see why some actors love being on stage versus movies. Like it's real, it's right there. People are laughing or they're gasping. And I just love that. I think that's great.
Being in front doing the storytelling, it's a passive form, meaning like it will continue on whether or not the audience member is watching it or not.
Right.
But as an author, that book doesn't read itself. So does it also seem like there's also a point where you have to be more proactive in engaging with a reader as compared to engaging with an audience member?
I think so. You've got to hook, it's in a way, you have to hook the reader, right? Books, right. You got to hook. I just read a great biography of Lyndon Johnson. I love history. Biography of Robert K. Rose, such a famous author. And he hooked me. First chapter, about the assassination of JFK, and you're on the plane and the limousines and the secret. This book was like this thick. I could not put the book down because he hooked me right from the start. Boom. He had me in there. And I was like, oh, I got to read this. I said to my wife, I hope he lives. He's written the 5th volume. He's like 93. I'm like, I hope this guy lives long enough to write the final version. There's a documentary out about him right now called Turn Every Page, about how he and his editor, you can stream it. It's such a good documentary about how an author and an editor work together, to create a book.
And so how about that? How is working with an editor different than, as you say, working with some advice folks that are doing storytelling?
So for me, I picked up what's called a line editor just to go through like every period and the commas and all that stuff. And I spent $1,000 on that. Then I had all these people look at it, and someone said to me, you will still have in the finished product a typo or something. I said, impossible. I've read this thing. And sure enough, my son calls me, hey, Dad, page 36, 5th line. I found 3 typos in Robert K. Rose's book, and that's won the National Book Award. But I didn't hire. And then instead of having like ordinarily, right, you would pick an editor. Right. I didn't do that because that costs money. But I sent it to a lot of people, friends of mine who are really, I consider literary people who really appreciate good literature. And, gave it to them. It said, one is Stephen Kiernan, very famous Vermont author, good friend of mine. He read it, and it was great. People were very, this worked, this didn't work. I'd get rid of this, shorten this chapter. It really helped a lot. So I didn't have an editor, but I had a bunch of different people who I trust, who really helped me craft it into a better book.
Okay. And so what were some of the things that you learned about when you wrote this book that made you a better storyteller?
That's a good question. What did I learn writing the book that made me a better storyteller? I think I've gotten better at getting to the action quicker, hooking people in. I think I've learned to do that. I think, and then, it's funny. somebody said, I was asked a question on this panel last week, you know, what advice would you give to other people who want to tell stories? And I was like, write stuff. I literally keep like a little pad with me, you know, like, cause we think we're going to remember these things, but people can say things or we do things. Oh, I'm going to remember that. That could be a good story. But like, I'm like, write it down because you're probably going to forget. You know, I tell the story of like, we have mentors at Spectrum, adults who are volunteers. We match them up with homeless kids and at-risk kids. And I was with some woman, you know, and she was saying, oh, I have a mentee. And, you know, the kid's 15 and parents are both in prison. And we do all stuff together. And she said, you know what my mentee said to me recently? I said, oh, what'd she say? She said, my mentee said to me, ever since I met you, I've become braver. And in the back of my mind, I was like, wow, what that woman just said to me is really important. And that's a story right there. So I finished the conversation and I ran right to my car where I keep a pad and a paper and pencil. And I wrote down, ever since I've met you, I've become braver. And I've used that story on stage, you know, because so I said, that's my advice. Write this stuff down, write these incidents down. You know, maybe you won't use all of them, but like we're humans and we forget. And then, you know, so that would be my advice, that, you know, write experiences down as much as you can.
You almost have like a list, and some of them might correspond with each other.
Right.
Will complement each other and make both stories stronger for you.
Yes, exactly.
When it comes to the stories, do you, as we mentioned earlier a bit, do you actually script anything out or make notes? Or when you actually get up in front of a stage or an audience, do you actually have a script written out, or is it just like bullet points?
So that's a good point. So if you do the Moth, they are so strict. You can't go up there with a scrap of paper, you know. And the other ones, I've been on stage for another one called Risk. They don't want but I don't memorize either, you know. So I will write like bullet points. I'm good with that, and then I will record it, you know, and then play it on the way into work, play it on the way back to work, play it on, you know what I mean? You're not memorizing it though, because to me, the most important thing is the emotion. There are times I'll tell a story and then I'm like, shoot, I forgot like this one line or, you know, or one segment of it. But I'm like, you know what? That's all right, because the emotion was there. You know, I didn't, if you memorize it right, I think you're sacrificing too much of the audience contact, you know? But this way, the passion is what that's what they're locking into. If you're passionate about the story, they're going to be passionate. So I try not to memorize, but I will write bullet points and then I'll record it. But again, I don't want to do it word for word, you know, and sometimes I'll even surprise myself on stage. I'll blurt something out that just occurs to me there that'll add, like, you know, add to the story. So I like having that freedom. And you don't know how the audience is going to react to it. There's things I think of the audience. Well, that was the funniest thing. So when I had to tell them off, first time I was on stage with Flynn, they said, you have 10 minutes to tell that story, okay? There's a guy with a violin right behind you. He's got a timer. When I hit 10 minutes, he's going to start playing. You better. I was like, it's all right, man. I practiced a million times, 9 minutes, 40 seconds. You know what I didn't count on, Barney?
The laughter and the things, yes.
Yes, I said something funny. And one person starts laughing and then the whole row and the whole audience. And I'm like,
But you bring up a good point, though. Like, once your book is written, it is written. Like, you can't tweak it after the fact. But with an audience, you can see which things land better than others. And so how much has your initial story that you told at the Moth, how much has that changed or tweaked based off of, say, geography or audience or any of that?
It has changed because I've told that story a bunch of different times, you know. There are definitely things that I thought were funny and people didn't laugh, that I've taken out. And then there's stuff that I thought was just okay and I got a big reaction. So I'm like, okay, we're gonna add, you know, really embellish that one. You know, that one hit the mark. I didn't think it would, but it did. So it's so funny. It's so hard to tell. You can't always tell, right, with an audience. And every audience is different too, right? So one audience might gasp at something you say, another audience might just sit there, you know. But I've kind of learned, like, there's certain one, like there's one point, you know, I said, I'm getting ready to leave this church, you know, and I look at my watch and I said, you know, great, man. I'm thinking 10 minutes. Now I can go play golf. I mean, go to my regular church. And people always laugh at that. They like that.
So if people wanted to learn more about you, where's the best place they could go to?
So I when I did the book, I created a website, Mark Redmond Books, plural, books.com, because I had a prior book about 20 years ago. And
really,
the person who did my website said, you should, it's out of print now. But she said, you'll write more books. So markredmondbooks.com. So that would be the best place, you know, and to learn about me and about, you know, it's got some of my other stuff on there. So that's the best place. markredmondbooks.com.
So are you working on another book?
Not yet. It's funny you say that. I'm not working. I've written some more columns, you know, but I think I gotta get my money back. You know what I do think of? And before I did this, I paid somebody, an artist, to illustrate. Somebody has said to me, this book could be a good not a graphic novel, because it's not a novel. It could be a good graphic memoir, you know?
Okay.
So if I could sell enough of this one and use the proceeds, I would love to pay. I think that'd be cool, especially just that one story of the one guy who I was his counselor 42 years ago, and I used to visit him in prison. And I'm like, that story, that could be a graphic memoir right there. Right there. Right. That would be a huge young adult, I believe, a huge young adult hit. About two people from such different. He grew up in the projects, cocaine addict, everything, you know. I grew up in the lily white suburbs, you know. And yet we're like best friends. We like text each other every day. He came to my wedding, you know. That right there is kind of that would be an incredible graphic story, I think.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. But so listen, Mark, you got to come back on then when you get that.
I will. Love to come back on, Barney. Love to. Love
Perfect.
To. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on, Barney. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. How important is it a sense of what's the word I'm looking for? This is the best part about this, Mark. I can edit out this part later and make it asking the question so smoothly.
Sure.
Is not the word nostalgia. What's the word where I'm trying to think of where like there's a what's the word I'm looking for? The word